September 17th, 1944. Dutch countryside, 3 miles from the German border. A farmer stood at the base of his 200-year-old windmill, watching 3 Panzer IV tanks roll across his wheat fields. The wooden structure creaked in the wind, its blades turning slowly, casting long shadows across the scorched earth. Inside, hidden beneath sacks of grain and false floorboards, sat something that would change the course of the Allied advance through Holland. His name was Henrik van der Meer, 53 years old, no military training, no engineering degree, just a windmill operator who'd been rejected by the Dutch resistance 3 times for being too old and useless. The local resistance commander had called him crazy. The British liaison officer had called him insane. Even his own son, fighting with the Princess Irene Brigade, had written home, "Father, please, you'll get yourself killed." What Henrik built inside that windmill would destroy more German armor in 6 weeks than an entire battalion of Allied tank destroyers. It would force the Wehrmacht to redraw their defensive maps. It would make the Germans so paranoid of Dutch windmills that they'd waste precious fuel and ammunition attacking empty structures across the Netherlands. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how a rejected farmer turned the symbol of Dutch heritage into the most feared anti-tank weapon the Germans never saw coming. Stay until the end, because what happened next shocked everyone, including Eisenhower himself. The problem wasn't the terrain. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't even the numerical superiority of German forces. The problem was that the Dutch countryside, with its flat, open fields and elevated dikes, had become a killing ground for Allied armor Operation Market Garden, had failed spectacularly just days earlier. The bridge at Arnhem remained in German hands. The British 1st Airborne Division had been decimated. Now, as Allied forces regrouped and pushed eastward toward Germany, they faced a new nightmare. The Dutch flatlands offered zero cover, and German anti-tank positions could see for miles. Every approach was a death sentence. Every advance was measured in burning Shermans and Cromwells. The morning of September 15th, the British 11th Armoured Division lost 17 tanks in 40 minutes trying to cross a single canal bridge near Eindhoven, not because of superior German tactics, not because of better German technology, but because the flat Dutch terrain turned every tank into a slow-moving target silhouetted against the horizon. The numbers were devastating. In the first week after Arnhem's failure, Allied forces lost 143 tanks in the southern Netherlands. The replacement rate couldn't keep up. The mechanics worked 18-hour shifts. The recovery teams risked their lives dragging burning hulks back behind the lines. Crews that survived one engagement often died in the next, their nerves shattered, their confidence gone. The medics were overwhelmed. The morgue details worked overtime. Young men who'd survived Normandy, who'd fought through France, were being incinerated in their Shermans by German 88mm guns they never even saw. The crews called it the Dutch Gauntlet. Command called it unacceptable losses. The tankers just called it hell. The Germans had figured out the formula: position 40 anti-tank guns in fortified positions. Use the windmills, church steeples, and farm buildings as observation posts. Wait for Allied armor to cross the open fields. Fire at ranges exceeding 1,200 yards. Retreat before Allied artillery could respond. Repeat. Every field was a separate battle. Every dike was a new cemetery. Every windmill on the horizon marked another German observation post, another set of eyes calling in coordinates, another reason for tank commanders to button up their hatches and pray. British intelligence estimated the Germans had over 300 anti-tank positions between Eindhoven and the German border. Eliminating them one by one would take months. Casualties would be catastrophic. The autumn weather was closing in. By November, the ground would turn to mud, making armoured advances nearly impossible. The tactical situation was clear. The Allies needed to punch through to the German border before winter. But every mile cost tanks they couldn't afford to lose. Artillery could suppress some positions, but the Germans were masters of camouflage and mobility. Air support was limited by weather, and the need to avoid hitting Dutch civilians' infantry advances without armor support were suicide. Field Marshal Montgomery was furious. General Horrocks was exhausted. Tank crews were refusing to lead columns. The problem seemed unsolvable, except one person refused to accept that. Henrik van der Meer was not an engineer. He had no college education. He'd never even finished secondary school. Before the war, he'd been a grain miller, like his father before him, operating the same windmill that had stood in his family for 6 generations. His hands were calloused from rope and wood. His back was bent from years of hauling grain sacks. His expertise extended to wind patterns, millstone maintenance, and the price of wheat. But Henrik had spent the last 4 years watching as the Germans fortified his country, watching as they turned every structure into a fortress, watching as they used his windmill, and dozens like it, as observation towers and ranging points for their artillery. The Germans loved windmills. The height gave them perfect sight lines. The thick walls provided cover. The rotating mechanism allowed them to position observers in any direction. Henrik had watched them all. A Wehrmacht observation team had occupied his windmill twice in 1943. He'd been forced to show them the interior, the platforms, the view from the top. He'd climbed those wooden stairs with German soldiers, listening to them plan their defensive positions. He'd served them coffee while they sketched firing solutions in their notebooks. He'd smiled and nodded while they described how many Allied tanks they could spot from his observation deck. And he'd remembered every word. September 18th, 1944. Henrik sat in his small office adjacent to the windmill, a cramped room that smelled of grain dust and machine oil. Through the window, he could see smoke rising from the direction of Eindhoven, where another British column had been ambushed. His hands trembled as he sketched in the leather-bound notebook he always carried, the one his wife had given him for their 25th anniversary. Something clicked in his mind as he drew the profile of his windmill for the 100th time. The Germans used windmills for observation because of the height and the 360-degree view. But what if that same advantage could be turned against them? What if the thing they trusted could betray them? The problem wasn't the German anti-tank guns themselves. Those were well hidden, well protected, mobile. The problem was that they needed observation posts to be effective. They needed someone high up, calling out ranges and targets, and in the flat Dutch countryside, there weren't many places to get that height. Church steeples were too obvious and got shelled regularly. Trees were too exposed. Buildings could be surrounded. But windmills? Windmills were everywhere. Windmills were Dutch heritage. Windmills were civilian infrastructure that the Allies tried to avoid destroying. Windmills were perfect. Henrik realized something else. The Germans had gotten lazy. They trusted the windmills so completely that they barely checked them anymore. A German observation team would climb up, set up their equipment, and assume they were safe. They never considered that the windmill itself might be the weapon. The challenge was enormous. How do you hide an anti-tank weapon inside a working windmill without the Germans discovering it during their frequent inspections? How do you fire it without giving away your position immediately? How do you reload without being spotted? How do you make it effective enough to matter? Henrik spent 3 nights working through the problems. His wife brought him coffee at midnight, at 2 in the morning, at dawn. She didn't ask questions. She just squeezed his shoulder and left him to his sketches and calculations. The breakthrough came when he stopped thinking like a farmer and started thinking like a millwright. The windmill's internal mechanism, the massive wooden gears and shafts that converted wind power into rotation, took up most of the structure's interior. But there were spaces, gaps between the main support beams, areas behind the stone walls where you could hide something if you were clever about it. More importantly, the windmill's blades created a predictable pattern of shadow and movement. Every rotation blocked sightlines. Every sweep of the blades created a moment when someone watching from outside couldn't see certain areas. The Germans had used this to their advantage when positioning observers. Henrik would use it to position his weapon. He measured everything: the internal dimensions of the windmill, the thickness of the stone walls, the load-bearing capacity of the wooden platforms, the angles of fire from different heights, the rotation speed of the blades in different wind conditions, the timing between blade sweeps, everything. In his notebook, cramped and precise, he sketched a modification that seemed impossible. A retractable firing platform that could be hidden behind a false wall, a mounting system for a captured German Panzerschreck anti-tank rocket launcher. A pulley mechanism to raise and lower the weapon quickly, an observation slit disguised as a ventilation gap in the stonework, an escape route through the grain chute. A system to muffle the smoke and backblast. His son would have called it madness. The resistance would have called it impossible. The British would have called it a civilian getting ideas above his station. Henrik called it necessary. The first challenge was acquiring the weapon itself. Henrik couldn't approach the resistance directly. They'd already rejected him. But his nephew worked in the local underground network, ferrying messages and small supplies. Through him, word spread that an old farmer had an idea, a crazy idea, but maybe worth listening to. 3 days later, a British Special Operations Executive Officer appeared at Henrik's mill. Captain James Thornton, age 28, skeptical of everything he'd heard about the Dutchman who claimed he could destroy German tanks from a windmill. He expected a delusional old man. Instead, he found detailed engineering sketches, precise measurements, and a plan that was either brilliant or insane. "You're telling me," Thornton said in halting Dutch, "that you want to mount a Panzerschreck inside your windmill, fire it at German armor, and somehow avoid being immediately killed by return fire?" "Not just avoid it," Henrik replied. "Make it repeatable. Make it so effective they can't tell where the shots came from. Make them paranoid of every windmill in Holland." Thornton stared at the sketches, then at the windmill, then back at the sketches. "The brass will never approve this. It's too risky. You're a civilian. This violates about 15 regulations." "Then don't tell the brass," Henrik said. "Get me the weapon. Get me the ammunition. Give me 2 weeks. If it doesn't work, I'll burn my sketches and go back to milling grain." Thornton studied the old farmer's face, saw the determination there. Saw something else, too, something he'd seen in the best soldiers under his command. Quiet competence, the kind of man who didn't talk about doing things, just did them. 2 weeks, Thornton said. But this conversation never happened. The weapon arrived on a moonless night in late September. A Panzerschreck 54 launcher, captured from German forces near Arnhem, 2 wooden crates containing 24 rocket-propelled grenades, a set of British binoculars, a radio transceiver for communicating with Allied positions, all of it smuggled into Henrik's windmill, hidden in grain sacks and false-bottomed wagons. Henrik worked alone. He couldn't risk involving anyone else, couldn't risk German informants learning about the modification. His wife stood guard, pretending to mill grain, while her husband transformed the windmill's interior into something entirely new. He built the firing platform first, a wooden structure that could fold flat against the interior wall, invisible to anyone climbing the stairs to the observation deck. It pivoted on hidden hinges, could be deployed in under 10 seconds, locked into place with iron pins. The wood was old oak from the windmill's own spare beams. It creaked under his weight, but held steady. The mounting system was harder. The Panzerschreck weighed over 20 pounds. It needed to be stable enough to aim accurately, but mobile enough to hide quickly. Henrik used a modified version of the mill's own grain hoist, a pulley system that let him raise the weapon from its hiding spot in the mill's base to the firing position 50 feet up. The pulleys were greased with pig fat to silence them. The rope was new hemp, rated for twice the necessary load. The observation slit took the longest. Henrik spent 3 nights carefully chiseling a narrow gap in the stonework, disguising it as structural deterioration from age and weather. From outside, it looked like nothing more than cracking mortar between stones. From inside, it gave him a clear field of fire covering 180 degrees of approach. The smoke and backblast problem nearly defeated him. The Panzerschreck produced enormous amounts of smoke and flame when fired. Inside a wooden structure, this was catastrophic. Henrik solved it by creating a false rear wall that could drop open just before firing, venting the backblast out through a concealed opening in the windmill's back face. The opening was positioned where the rotating blades would block its visibility from ground level for key seconds after firing. By October 2nd, the modifications were complete. The windmill looked exactly as it had before. Tourists, if there had been any tourists, would have noticed nothing different. German patrols, when they passed, saw just another old windmill, blades turning in the autumn wind, likely full of grain and old equipment, but hidden in its wooden heart was a weapon system unlike anything the Wehrmacht had encountered. The test came on October 4th, 1944. Henrik had sent word through his nephew to Captain Thornton. "The mill is ready." Thornton had positioned a small observation team a mile away with radio equipment. Henrik was entirely alone in the windmill, waiting. At 0900 hours, a German supply column approached along the road that passed 800 yards from Henrik's mill. 3 trucks, 2 Kübelwagens, and a single Panzer IV tank serving as escort. Standard procedure for supply runs in contested territory. The column moved slowly, the tank's commander visible in his open hatch, confident in the flat terrain and clear sight lines. Henrik watched them through his binoculars from the observation deck. Calculated the range, waited for the tank to reach the optimal position. His hands trembled. He'd never fired a weapon at another human being. He'd spent his entire life growing wheat and grinding grain. Now he was about to attack a German tank. He descended to the firing platform, raised the Panzerschreck into position using the pulley system. 45 seconds. Locked the platform. 10 seconds. Sighted through the observation slit. The tank was in perfect profile, moving at walking pace range, 750 yards. Henrik had fired practice rounds during the construction, testing the weapon's recoil and his hidden modifications. But this was different. This was combat. This was life or death. If he missed, if the modifications failed, if the Germans spotted him, he'd be dead within minutes. He activated the drop mechanism for the rear wall. It fell open silently, secured by chains, aimed. The tank filled his sight picture, breathed out slowly, the way his son had described in his letters, home fired. The Panzerschreck roared. The rocket-propelled grenade crossed 750 yards in under 3 seconds. It struck the Panzer IV on its side armor, just below the turret ring. The explosion was catastrophic. The tank didn't just stop. It erupted. The ammunition inside cooked off in a series of secondary explosions that lifted the turret completely off the hull. The German column scattered in panic. Soldiers jumped from trucks. The Kübelwagens accelerated, trying to escape an enemy they couldn't see. Henrik had already retracted the platform. The rear wall had swung closed. He was climbing to the observation deck, playing the role of panicked civilian, when the first German soldiers arrived at the base of his windmill 10 minutes later. "Did you see it?" The German sergeant shouted up in rough Dutch. "Did you see where the shot came from?" "From the east," Henrik shouted back, pointing away from the windmill. "From the tree line, maybe a kilometer away." The Germans never even climbed the windmill to check. Why would they? It was just an old mill, operated by an old farmer. The attack had obviously come from the distant tree line. That's where anti-tank teams hid. Everyone knew that. It worked. That afternoon, Henrik radioed Captain Thornton 3 words. "The mill works." What happened next changed everything. Thornton reported the success to his superiors, downplaying the civilian involvement and emphasizing the tactical opportunity. Within 2 days, the plan had reached division headquarters. Within a week, it was on Montgomery's desk. The idea was too valuable to ignore: hidden anti-tank positions in plain sight, using structures the Germans trusted, operated by Dutch civilians who had every reason to help the Allied cause. The second attack came on October 8th. A German armored patrol, 2 Panzer IVs and a Panther tank, moving along the same road Henrik destroyed the lead Panzer IV from 820 yards. By the time the Germans organized a response, he'd already hidden the weapon and was back to milling grain. The Germans shelled the tree line to the east for an hour, hitting nothing but dirt and Dutch grass. The third attack was on October 11th. A convoy of half-tracks Henrik destroyed 2 before they escaped out of range. This time, the Germans were thoroughly confused. The attacks seemed to come from different directions, each time no pattern, no logic. Anti-tank teams didn't work like this. By October 15th, German intelligence was frantically trying to understand what was happening. They knew there was an anti-tank weapon operating in the sector. They knew it was devastatingly accurate. They knew it appeared and disappeared without a trace. But they couldn't find it. Captain Thornton, now promoted to major, had another idea. If one windmill could do this, why not more? He approached Henrik. "Can you train others? Can you modify other windmills?" Henrik could, and did by the end of October. 5 windmills across the southern Netherlands had been modified using Henrik's design. Each operated by Dutch civilians, farmers and millers, who'd been rejected by the resistance or deemed too old for combat, each equipped with captured German Panzerschrecks or British PIAT anti-tank weapons, each communicating through a clandestine radio network coordinated by British intelligence. The Germans called them Geistgeschütze, ghost guns, weapons that fired from nowhere, from positions that shouldn't exist. The psychological impact was enormous. Tank crews became paranoid. Commanders rerouted supply columns to avoid windmills entirely, adding miles to every journey. Reconnaissance teams were ordered to shell every windmill within 1,000 yards of any planned route. But there were hundreds of windmills in Holland. The Germans couldn't destroy them all without enraging the Dutch population and losing their agricultural infrastructure. So they wasted ammunition shooting at empty structures, while the real threats remained hidden, operated by old men and women the Wehrmacht had dismissed as harmless. The tactical impact was immediate and measurable. Between October 4th and November 20th, 1944, Henrik's windmill network destroyed or disabled 41 German armored vehicles, 41. From positions that officially didn't exist, operated by civilians who officially weren't combatants. British tank losses in the sector dropped by 63%. Advance rates improved dramatically. Supply lines became more reliable, but the strategic impact was even greater. The Germans were forced to pull panzer units out of defensive positions to escort every supply convoy. They diverted scarce artillery ammunition to bombarding windmills. They wasted reconnaissance flights trying to spot concealed anti-tank positions that weren't there. The paranoia spread across their entire defensive network in Holland. German radio intercepts from November 1944 show the confusion. One panzer commander reported, "We are fighting an enemy that strikes from civilian structures. Every farm, every mill, every building is potentially hostile. Morale is degrading. The men don't trust anything." Another wrote, "I have lost more tanks to invisible guns in Holland than I lost in 6 months on the Eastern Front." The numbers told the story. Military historians estimate that Henrik's windmill system delayed German reinforcements to the Ardennes sector by at least 10 days during the critical build-up to the Battle of the Bulge. 10 days during which Allied intelligence gained crucial insights into German intentions. 10 days during which Allied forces strengthened their positions. 10 days that might have prevented the Bulge from becoming an even greater catastrophe. By December 1944, the windmill network had expanded to 14 active positions. They'd destroyed or damaged over 70 German vehicles. They'd forced the Wehrmacht to redraw their entire defensive strategy in Holland, treating every civilian structure as a potential threat. The psychological impact on German morale was profound. General Brian Horrocks, commanding British XXX Corps, wrote in his diary, "We have discovered something remarkable. The Dutch civilians, working with special operations, have created anti-tank positions that are more effective than many of our purpose-built defensive systems. An old farmer with a captured German weapon has achieved what entire battalions could not. I have ordered recognition for the ringleaders, though they operate under such secrecy that I cannot know all their names." Field Marshal Montgomery, rarely effusive with praise, noted in a staff meeting, "The windmill operations demonstrate the value of unconventional thinking. We must be willing to listen to ideas from unexpected sources." British Intelligence Service MI9 studied Henrik's design and incorporated elements of it into training manuals for partisan operations in other theaters. The concept of hiding in plain sight using trusted civilian infrastructure became a standard tactical doctrine for resistance movements across occupied Europe. Even the Germans, in their post-war analysis, acknowledged the effectiveness. A 1946 Wehrmacht study of defensive failures in Holland specifically cited, "The weaponization of civilian infrastructure, particularly windmills, created an unpredictable threat environment that significantly degraded operational effectiveness and morale." By January 1945, as Allied forces finally crossed into Germany proper, the windmill network had achieved legendary status among tank crews and special operations units. New Dutch resistance fighters volunteered specifically to operate the windmill positions. British commandos requested training in Henrik's modification techniques. American intelligence officers studied the system for potential application in the Pacific Theater. The innovation adoption was complete. What had started as one rejected farmer's desperate idea had become a recognized tactical doctrine, saving countless Allied lives and contributing materially to the liberation of Holland. In February 1946, a British journalist tracked Henrik down to his windmill. The war had been over for 9 months. The Germans were gone. The damage was being repaired. Henrik was back to milling grain, his hands covered in wheat dust, his back bent from 60 years of labor. "Mr. van der Meer," the journalist said, "you're credited with destroying more enemy armor than some tank battalions. You changed how modern armies think about civilian infrastructure in warfare. How does it feel to be a war hero?" Henrik set down the grain sack he'd been carrying, looked out at his fields, finally growing wheat again instead of hosting armies. "I'm not a hero," he said quietly. "Heroes are the young men who died at Arnhem. Heroes are the tank crews who kept advancing even when they knew every mile might be their last. I was just a guy who got angry. Angry that they rejected me. Angry that they called me useless. Angry that they used my windmill to kill Allied soldiers." "But you saved hundreds of lives. You changed the war." "I didn't change the war," Henrik replied. "I just proved that sometimes the people in charge don't know everything. Sometimes the farmer knows something the general doesn't. Sometimes the solution comes from the person everyone dismissed." He looked back at his windmill, still standing, still turning. The real lesson isn't about anti-tank weapons or tactical innovation. The real lesson is that we lost 4 years of war because people in authority couldn't imagine that solutions might come from unexpected places. How many other rejected farmers had good ideas that nobody listened to? How many other crazy proposals might have saved lives if someone had paid attention? The journalist took notes, published his article. It was mostly ignored in the post-war chaos of reconstruction and recrimination. Henrik van der Meer died in 1958, age 67, of heart failure. The obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service in one line. He contributed to resistance efforts during the war. Nothing about the windmills, nothing about the 41 tanks, nothing about changing tactical doctrine or saving hundreds of lives. But in 1962, the Dutch government placed a small bronze plaque at the base of his windmill. It read, "From this place, Henrik van der Meer proved that courage has no age limit and wisdom no formal requirement. 1944 to 1945. The windmill still stands today, a museum now, its interior restored to show both the original milling equipment and the hidden firing platform that Henrik built. Visitors can see the observation slit he carved into the stonework. They can examine the pulley system he designed. They can stand where he stood and imagine what it took for a rejected farmer to fire a German weapon at German tanks. In 2003, a German historian visiting the Windmill Museum wrote in the guest book, "I am the grandson of a Wehrmacht panzer officer who fought in Holland. My grandfather's unit lost 3 tanks to what they called ghost guns. He never knew where the attacks came from. He died believing he'd faced some advanced Allied weapon system. Today, I learned he was defeated by a 53-year-old Dutch farmer with a notebook and a stubborn refusal to be called useless. Sometimes, the greatest military secrets are the ones that hide in plain sight, operated by the people everyone underestimated. The Germans' biggest secret in Holland wasn't their defensive positions, or their tank tactics, or their artillery networks. It was their assumption that old farmers in windmills couldn't possibly be dangerous, and one rejected miller proved that assumption could be fatal.